About 400 years ago, there lived a very great Christian who was also a scientific genius. He was responsible for laying the foundations for the transport systems of the modern world. He also invented the embryo of the computer. His name was Blaise Pascal. Pascal once said this: without Christ, we do not know what life is, or death, or ourselves, or God. Let me repeat. Without Christ, we do not know what life is, nor death, nor ourselves, nor God. Now, I want to talk to you tonight about Russia and the gospel, because great things are happening in that country. But I want to put it in the setting of the Christ of Calvary. So come back with me, if you would, to nearly 20 centuries ago, to a morning that probably dawned bright and fair on one of the smallest lands in the world. I can imagine the glory of the sunset the night before being followed by an even more glorious morning. I can see the shimmering waters of that beautiful jewelled sea, the Lake of Galilee, surrounded by fields that wave with corn and other crops. I can see the children playing on the beaches of the lake. But 9 o'clock that day, miles away down south, cruel men nailed 3 men to crosses. And in the next 6 hours, there was cursing and swearing and blasphemy. And there was pain and agony. There was bloodshed. There was darkness. And finally a great earthquake. And even the temple, like the ancients who used to tear their clothes when they were in mourning, the temple tore its veil as the earth shook. The earth seemed to be echoing the heaving of the heart on the central cross. As that heart shook and finally broke, the earth shook. But the very shaking opened the grave, you remember. And on the third day all was different. There was another glorious dawning. But this time, instead of 3 crosses, the Son of Righteousness came out of the tomb. And when he came out, those other tombs that had been opened by the earthquake and his death yielded up some of the saints of former ages. And later they ascended with him to glory. Now, Calvary is both a microscope and a telescope of history and science, and of all truth and all reality. Calvary was no birthday party. Blasphemy, cursing, bloodshed, terrible grief. No birthday party, and neither is life. We sort of expect that life should be a playground, but life isn't a playground, it's a school. All of us attend the University of Hard Knocks, where the school cry is out and the colours are black and blue, and everybody's enrolled. Everybody. Calvary tells the truth about life. But you know, there wasn't only darkness and pain and blood and cursing and blasphemy. There was also hope and love there that day. Imagine a man being crucified as a felon, promising heaven to another supposed felon. What faith? What hope? He could talk about paradise, heaven, when he was in hell. Calvary was a mini hell. But there was hope there was faith there was love there was a love that said at the beginning and the end of the 7 sayings, Father. That's why he survived the cross, because he believed in the love of his Heavenly Father. There's no other way of surviving life than that belief. Anything short of believing that God loves me is quite inadequate for the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. The person who believes in God's love for them is invincible. With all the onslaughts of Satan, though they come thick and many, and it's a true saying that troubles rarely come singly. Just as arrows are rarely on their own in the air, they come as a shower. But Christ could survive the cross because he believed in the love of God. So Calvary wasn't just a place of blood and tears, it was a place of faith, to believe in heaven to come, a place of hope, believe the future would be better. It was a place of love. There were people there that loved him as well as people there that hated him. The 20th century dawned like that fair Israeli morning. At the beginning of this century, the wise men of earth thought that war had been abolished, that soon poverty and crime would be abolished. The morning of history was splendid at the opening of the 20th century, but it has been the bloodiest of all centuries. We have seen in this century 4 genocides. First was the Armenians, so far back in the century that most people don't even remember about it. Then the Ukrainians, when Stalin purposely let millions starve in the Ukraine while he sold the Russian crops that could have saved them. He wanted to wipe out the Kulak, small landowners. So he had the genocide in the Ukraine. Then the genocide of the Jewish people under Adolf Hitler. And then the genocide of Cambodia. 4 genocides. I want to turn your attention to what happened in Russia. And remember as we do so that Russia is the biggest country on earth. What we call the USSR occupies 1/6 of the Earth's surface. There are 300 million people. There are 300 million people there. So they're the 3rd largest in population. China, India, the former USSR. And in terms of language, you have English and Chinese, and then you have Russian and Spanish coming together. So here's a country that spanned 11 time zones, that has over 100 nationalities. Do you know how the national anthem begins in that great land? The indestructible union of the Soviet republics. That's how it begins. And you and I, in the last few years, have seen a miracle. You know, at the turn of the century, all the communists that existed could fit in the choir loft. At the turn of 1980, communists controlled almost half the world. But in our day, we have seen the dissolution of one of the 2 great superpowers and the tremendous reduction of threat of World War III. And also a reduction, though not an abolition, of the nuclear threat. Now remember, in recent decades, the nations of Earth have spent $50 billion an hour in preparing for or waging war. 50 billion. There would be no third world and no poverty, whatever, but for war. And in this country, we have spent the most of all because we've been afraid of Russia. What's the story behind Russia? How could it be that that great country, which housed the Eastern Orthodox Church, one of the 2 chief organisations of Christianity in the world, 1 out of every 6 Christians belongs to the Eastern Orthodox Church. So how could it be that in that great country Christianity should be abolished? The story begins in the 19th century with a Jewish family where of 9 boys only 1 survived to midlife. He was a boy that didn't like work, but he liked books. And he liked power, and he liked violence, but he couldn't handle money, and he hated money lenders. And out of that experience of his, forever
being forced to borrow money because he didn't work, and never being able to properly pay it back, he formed a political creed that became known as communism, for I'm talking about Karl Marx. Karl Marx, as the son of German Jews, became a professed Christian but gave it up after attending a Jesuit school. Then he spent 30 years organising his creed. He went to England, and there he sat in the great London library day after day, month after month, year after year, not doing an objective study of economics, but searching out bits and pieces from newspapers and journals that he could fit into his great book, Das Kapital. He married a beautiful woman whom he loved, but he didn't love enough. He had sexual relations with her servant, brought forth a son whom he never acknowledged, not once, though the son was always within distance. Never acknowledged his son. He loved his children, but he didn't love them enough. Because he wouldn't work, several of them died because of their poverty. Marx has been described as a cross between an ape and a cat. He looked dirty, he spoke angrily, he was fierce to anyone that differed from him, he smoked heavily, drank heavily, ate very spiced foods, and suffered from a crop of boils for 25 years because he refused to change his eating habits. These boils covered him everywhere, I mean everywhere, and made him angrier still. That was the beginning of communism. Some years went by and Karl Marx was reincarnated, not literally, but spiritually. There was World War I, and Germany sent a plague bacillus from Switzerland to Petrograd in Russia to infect 100 million people, and later to infect over 2 billion people. What was this plague bacillus? Well, it was Marx reincarnated, so to speak. His name was Vladimir Lenin. He was in exile in Switzerland, but he made an arrangement with the German government that he and some of his fellow communists should be put in a sealed train and smuggled through war zones, and ultimately gotten through Finland and landed on the station of Petrograd in Russia. So they sealed the train, the doors were shut, and they smuggled them through. And when he arrived, he gave a fiery speech that launched communism in modern Russia. When Lenin ultimately took over, after having talked about the cruelty of the Tsars and the terrible bureaucracy of the Tsars, he perpetuated all those errors in a far, far more extreme way. The Tsar used to put to death 17 people a year, executions throughout all of Russia. The first year Lenin took over, he executed 1,000. You know, the word revolution suggests a circle, which means you come back to where you start. And that's usually what happened with a revolution. Much go, often much glamour, but rarely does it change things on a long scale, very rarely. You usually come back to where you start. Lenin suffered a stroke in his early 50s. He spent years of impotence and rage and frustration. And he was frustrated because the revolution wasn't going well. He saw he had a bureaucracy worse than the Tsars. And he was afraid of Joseph Stalin. So when he wrote his last will, he wrote this: "Let my comrades realise that this is no trifle, but a matter of great importance. Comrade Stalin should not be preserved as the secretary of the party. He does not have a personality that gets on well with other people. I appeal to my comrades they should remove him." So it was too late. Stalin was grabbing more and more power. And when Lenin died, Stalin instituted a cult of Lenin. Because you see, you can't do without a religion. You get rid of one, you've got to put in another. So instead of the Bible, I had Das Kapital. Instead of Jesus Christ, I had Vladimir Lenin. Everywhere throughout the Soviet Union you see statues of Lenin. I was coming home one night about 2 o'clock in the morning actually. I was very glad to see a statue of Lenin. I thought, we're back in a certain city. We're back. I was wrong. We travelled another 2 hours. That statue was everywhere. Everywhere it was. You see. So Stalin professed great reverence for Lenin. He put up all these statues everywhere so that people could worship him. And you know how they have a mausoleum there outside the Kremlin. I went there. You're in a long line of tourists. You see the changing of the guard, and you go downstairs and you see this wax-like figure who may have adored for so long. But Stalin wanted to start a cult of his own. And in the years that followed, Stalin had busts of himself put out everywhere. You couldn't enter a bank, a school, a business office without seeing an effigy of Stalin. 2,000 registered songs in his name came among the Russian people. You began everything with an ode to Stalin. Trotsky was his great enemy. Trotsky said that Stalin was the most eminent mediocrity of the party. So Stalin had assassins chase Trotsky after exiling him until they caught up with him in Mexico. First of all, a fusillade of bullets were sent to his home. He couldn't catch him. And on a later occasion they caught him and killed him with an axe. Having got rid of Trotsky, Stalin wanted to show what he could do, so he set about the collectivisation of the farms. But you know that has never worked. It's been the Achilles heel of Russia. It has never worked. And the reason is simple. Professors say this: the government pretends to pay us, so we pretend to work. So it's never worked, you see. It's never worked. Millions of small Russian landowners resisted, so Stalin murdered them. Millions. He confessed to murdering 10 million. Solzhenitsyn says the number was far in excess of that. Stalin became paranoid. And because the plans to industrialise the country weren't doing as well as he hoped they might do, he had a lot of show trials beginning about 1936. He took 98 out of the 139 men of his Central Committee and had them shot. And when the communists came in from all over the world, the international communist meeting, he took almost 1,000 of them. They were either shot or sent to the Gulag Archipelago, which is the string of Siberian labour camps in the frozen north. Stalin got rid of the best brains of the army, the government and industry. That's one reason why when Hitler invaded Russia, he could do 450 miles in 1 month, because the bureaucracy had buried their brains. So Stalin is probably the most bloody dictator that has ever lived. And estimates of the people for whose death he was responsible range from 20 million to about 80 million. As Stalin was dying, he was plotting another purge, this time with the Jewish doctors who attended on the officials of the Kremlin. But he died before it could be discharged, and the other men in the Kremlin just dropped the plan. What is Russia like today? Let me tell you a few things about Russia. First of all, there are 20 million more women than men. Stalin waged World War II in a very extravagant manner. He didn't care about the deaths of millions of his soldiers. It could have been fought much more parsimoniously and much more successfully. Pretty well every Russian family lost someone in that war. Between 20 and 30 million soldiers on the Russian side. So there are 20 million more women than men in Russia. The average woman has 7 abortions in her lifetime. Contraception is only used by 15% of Russian women. There are 30,000 abortions a day, and there are 3,500 Russian doctors who do nothing but abortions.
2,000 of those abortions every day are of teenagers. Russia has 15,000 churches. You may say, well, that's amazing. Do you know how many there are in this country? 350,000. Russia has 15,000 churches, each one of which functioned with a communist official installed, who controlled what was preached and what happened. That's the reason for the underground church in Russia. They didn't want communist control, they had to go underground. But all the official churches had a communist official in the church to control what was said. So rigorous Christianity in its official form died. There are 18,000 hospitals in Russia. 12,000 of them are without running water. 5,000 are without sewerage. 3,000 are without hot water. I preached inside a Russian hospital. The lady in charge, the doctor, was a beautiful lady, fine woman. But when I went into the wards to pray with people there, they were so stark. I'd never seen medical rooms so stark. Just a bed or something that was necessary for the drip. There were people with amputated limbs, all sorts of conditions, but everything was so stark. One man shot up in bed and said, I reject Jesus Christ. Another one, a young sailor, said, I don't believe in anything. You see, for 70 years, communism had its anti-God propaganda, its anti-God museum. Distribution of Bibles was forbidden. Evangelizing, bringing people into the church was forbidden. And they have reaped a terrible harvest. The suicide rate is about 100% more proportionately than in this country. And it's terrible in this country. But it's about 100% more over there. But having told you there are 15,000 churches, Orthodox, Greek Orthodox churches, Russian Orthodox churches, here is an interesting fact. There's over 150,000 theatres. It's the same as in India. India has lots and lots of theatres because it's like the dope that helps them manage their hard lives. They can get into a theatre and escape for a few hours and then go back to reality. Only 1% of Russia is urban. Once you leave that 1%, you're in the third world. When I arrived in Moscow, it seemed to be yellow smoke going through the whole city. They told me that certain days of the month they were allowed to burn rubbish on the outside of the city. And that explains that. It wasn't always. The cities on the outside look somewhat like cities elsewhere, except you'll notice that many of them have up signs. They'll only accept hard currency, by which I mean American dollars. They'll not accept the ruble. Because you see, inflation has set in. When I was leaving for Russia, it was 150 rubles to the dollar. When I was leaving from Russia, 3 weeks later, it was 210. It's now over 300 rubles to the dollar. Inflation is now 2,000% a year. And the average worker in a village earns $9 a month. And the average person on an old age pension is getting $1.50 a month. Now, the other side of that story, of course, is that they can go from anywhere outside Moscow in that great city into the heart of the city for what would be 1 cent in our money. And their rent would amount to the equivalent of a few cents a week. And almost all Russians grow food. Potatoes are their second bread. They grow and grow potatoes to last them through winter. And when it's summer and time when there's plenty of food around, they eat a great deal of fresh food, which is just as well because they have a tremendous amount of alcohol in that country. 21 million hours per day are spent in lines trying to get alcohol. The police shut down 1,000 illicit stills every day. And 50,000 people die a year from poison alcohol in the homemade stills. So here's a country where the men die about 10 years before the women, where almost all the men smoke and drink, and a country that's hard, that's tough, that's drab, that's grey, that's dull. In the cities that I went into, it was obvious that nothing was ever repaired as it had to be. Nothing was repaired for aesthetic reasons. And you looked at the buses and the trolley buses and everything else, there'd be bits of the coping covering on the outside missing. Everything needed a painting. You'd go into the parks and there'd be slats of wood missing from the seats. No one ever seemed to replace them. Most things were sold from little card tables outside in the street, or women with buckets selling pears or tomatoes or something like that. There were very few real shops. It's hard for us in this country to imagine what it's like. I've been into the so-called shops in more than one place in Russia, and again they are grey and dull and almost empty. As I say, most stuff is sold outside from card tables, including books and produce and clothing. That's the way. Russia is a sad land. 99% of it is rural, and that means 99% of it is third world. In those villages, there are no proper toilets, just toilet pits. People get their water by going to a pump out in the street. I've watched them pump the water to take it into their houses. It is very dangerous for someone from the west to go into villages and eat there. I tried to avoid eating there. It was very, very difficult because I knew that the bacterial count in all the villages was such as someone from the west wouldn't be able to tolerate. But it's very hard to be courteous and keep knocking back food. And so I would accept something I knew was cooked. And on one occasion I got something that had probably been recooked. And you get food that's been cooked and then recooked and be contaminated. And I must have picked up a virus because that day I began to preach feeling perfectly well, and suddenly I knew I was going to faint. Some virus problem was spreading in body and mind, and I toppled over, fell 8 feet straight down into an orchestra pit. All the meetings in Russia are held in what they call palaces of culture. And so now that religion is allowed to be proclaimed, you have religion in these palaces of culture. And I fell straight down into one of these pits. And the Lord was actually very good to me in 1,000 ways, because I don't think there's any lasting damage. I've had what they call post-concussion syndrome, recurring dizziness, which I still get, but it's no longer overwhelming. I was very fortunate. I hit head and I couldn't lift anything for weeks because my ribs were so bruised and so on. But God was very good, but I'm just trying to tell you about the conditions in the villages. Open toilets, no running water, really hovels that most people live in. That's 99% of Russia. Spatially, not population-wise, but spatially. Only 1% of Russia is urban. In the 70s, Russia found that their oil and gas were beginning to run out. They had thought their supplies were endless, and Russia had survived because they had so much gas, so much oil, and they were selling it like crazy. And that kept the country afloat. But in the 70s, it began to run out, and their politicians knew change had to come. So when Gorbachev came in, he knew it was either change or the whole country would go down the tube. 1988, he paid a visit to the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church and apologised for what communism had done to the church. Then Gorbachev went to the Pope and said, we have to have freedom of religion in Russia, and I want your help in that, because the people have got to have values, something to live for. But as you know, Gorbachev has not survived. Communism died just a year or two ago officially I think it's starting up again now, and most of the men in control right throughout Russia are ex-communist leaders. Don't think that all those men have gone. Most of the men in control are still communists, though they profess that they have forsaken the old ways. But most of the people are still communists and control everything. But today, you'll never guess how many political parties there are in Russia. There are 1,000 political parties approximately in Russia today, where before there was one. Only one, no opposition. And now the church bells are tolling again. While I was there, a helicopter went over in this big city and put back the cross on the top of one Russian Orthodox church. In Moscow alone, there are hundreds of Sunday schools starting up. And the big cities are open to whatever's flooding in from the west, which means they get New Age and Satanism and all sorts of terrible things. But also many people are coming in with the gospel. A former student of mine, John Carter, took the first Protestant meetings ever known in the city of Gorky, and he had 14,000 people a day come to his meeting. He baptised 2,500 people there after months of meetings. So in the cities there is a big response now to people who will offer them any ray of hope, whether it's from error like New Age, whether it's from the cults like Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, or whether it's the gospel. It's different in the villages. In the villages, the Russian Orthodox Church is determined to maintain control. The advertisements for my meetings were torn down time after time. The first time I took a public meeting, the television crew came to me and holding the microphone before my mouth. They said, "What are you doing here? This country belongs religiously to the Russian Orthodox Church. Why have you come here to support the evangelical church?" And my answer was, well, the Russian Orthodox Church believes it is founded on the Bible. And the evangelicals believe they are founded on the Bible. I haven't come to support any church, I come to preach the Bible. But the Russian Orthodox Church everywhere is opposed to evangelical activity. So do not think from the reports that you hear that all of Russia is going gang-ho after the gospel. That's not true. It is true there's an openness in the big cities where individuals are not so much under the control of the church, but it's not so in 99% of the land which is rural, where the priests are in control. What are people like in Russia? I met some of the sweetest people I've ever met in Russia. To characterise them as people, you would say they are strong and they are patient, and they are sad. Those things are true of the Russian people. But they are open to the gospel. I've stayed, in the cities they have all these apartment houses. People live just in apartments. For decades it's often been two families in one huge room in many places. But I stayed in an apartment with a family of 12. You entered the door and you saw all the shoes. Tiny shoes, bigger shoes, bigger shoes, bigger shoes. 12 sets of shoes. And they took me in because it was somewhere up about the 10th story. The water for the bath and toilet only worked half a day. Can you imagine the situation? And a family of 12. And that sort of a setup. I remember in the early morning when I wanted to go for a walk, there was no lights on the outside. These apartment houses are the dreariest things you can imagine. They've made an effort to put up something for children, but it's a very, very poor effort. They just have a few things for children to play with, but very few. And when you enter a Russian apartment building, it's grey, it's dull, it's dirty, it's dank, it smells. A typical elevator will hold about 3 people. And certain lights are turned on and off at very odd hours, so you can be negotiating 10 flights of stairs with no lights whatever, as I do on certain occasions. And when I talk about the people, many wonderful people there. I was in one village and the minister, after I preached, took me home, and it was a 3-room apartment, a kitchen, a bathroom and then a bedroom. And he took me into the bedroom where there were two beds, and there was one bed bigger than the other, and he pointed to that bed and then he pointed to me. Then he pointed to a little bed and he pointed to himself. I guess his wife slept on a mattress in the kitchen. And had I offered to do that, they'd been offended. But so he surrendered the family bed, and I slept in the family bed. I remember in another village, a young minister came up to me one day and offered me what must have been a very precious thing to him, a copy of the scriptures in the original language. And I have thousands of books. So I thanked him for his kindness, but of course I refused to take it. Can you imagine, boy, a young man who probably owned about 5 books, wanting to give away one of his most precious books. When I had my accident in one of the palaces of culture, with me there travelled a lot of young people that provided music. And one of them had noticed that I drank from a plastic bottle of water because it's not safe for people from outside whose intestines are not used to what's over there to drink water that's not boiled, so I had some boiled water. And he'd seen me drinking this, so here I collapsed, and as I opened my eyes, he'd run way up to the bus to get my plastic bottle of water to bring it. He might have thought it was a special medicine, I don't know. But that was typical of the kindness. I think of my interpreter. He'd been a drug addict, and then he found the gospel. And sometimes when I was speaking, he would stop and he'd say, "Oh, Desmond," he'd say, "that's a wonderful thought." And I'd be thinking, "Well, Boris, tell them." But that was typical of the enthusiasm. In one palace of culture, I told the story that's found in 2 Kings 6 and 7 about the besieged city, how people were feeding on garbage, that the Lord had promised deliverance. Remember how the lepers crept out from inside the shadow of the city wall, made their way to the tents, thinking they'd be killed, but maybe they'd be fed before they were killed. And they found there was no one in the tent, you know the story. So they said the blessing and ate the food, and then they buried all the cutlery. It was in the next tent. The next tent, the light was on, the candles were burning, nobody was there. Again they say the blessing, they eat the food, and bury the cutlery. And then their conscience smites them. We do not good. This is the day of good tidings. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the word there is gospel. This is the day of the gospel. This is not good. We're having all these good things. We must go and tell the good tidings. So the lepers run up to the besieged city where the people are eating garbage, donkeys' heads and that sort of thing. No one will believe them. No one will believe it. So I applied the story. This world has been besieged by the devil. The world lives on garbage. Look what's on TV. Look at any magazine kiosk, in any place where they're selling modern literature. Most of it is garbage. You have to be very selective in what you see, watch, read today. The world lives on garbage. And yet the world's been redeemed and it doesn't know. Just as God back there had caused the enemy to go, he delivered them. And they didn't know. So the world's been delivered and it doesn't know. But the lepers find out. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Those that have a sense of need, they find the blessing. Blessed are those that are needy. Dear friends, this is one reason why life is so filled with sorrow. God wants us to realise that we're temporary. He wants us to realise the world doesn't satisfy. He wants us to realise there's something better coming. He wants us to know that our real hope should be in Him, not in anything physical down here or material or temporary. Everything is temporary. So the lepers found the treasure. The lepers got the blessing. And those that know their spiritual lepers and know the realities of life, which are sad and tragic, because Calvary gives us a view of life that's real. You know, most people don't want to face reality. Most people live in a world of illusion. They try to turn their hopes into realities rather than dealing with reality. But reality is tough because this is a world of rebellion and sin. That's why there's sorrow and death. There's been no death. There's been no pain. It's because we've rebelled against God. Even the innocent suffer. Christ on the cross was innocent, but he suffered. The innocent suffer in this life. But those who become aware of how shallow the world is, Those who see their spiritual need, they find the trend. So I told the story of One Palace of Culture, and when it was over, the man and woman came up to me and they said, now we see it. That makes the Bible a unity, the Old and the New Testament. It's united by the gospel. Thank you for that. They were young people and intelligent people, and they represent many in Russia who are looking for truth. So I found there were many wonderful people in that country who are just longing for the truth of the gospel. And we've got to pray and to work so that they will get it. You see, if the door shuts in Russia, it may become worse than it ever was before. Today, Russia's in terrible economic turmoil. It will take years and years for things to get better. And in such turmoil as that, dictators often arise. And if that happens in Russia, things will be much worse than before, which is one reason we want to do a little bit. We distributed 4,000 New Testaments in Russia. Everywhere we went, we gave New Testament. I've never signed so many books in all my life as when I was in Russia. When we gave out the Testaments, people would come up and ask them to be signed. When the bus that was taking me from city to city or village to village would pick up someone who wanted to lift, we'd give them the New Testament. Everywhere we went, we distributed the New Testaments. And you know, Gorbachev, in 1988, sent word to this country for 1 million copies of the Bible. But now the government presses are running them off. And very cheaply. I think the New Testament that I secured cost 15 cents each. I had inquired with prices in Australia, and this country was very high in Russia. But now their own presses are doing it. So God is opening doors in that country. Now I want to say the most important thing of all tonight. The communists had hoped to bring about utopia. The communists had hoped to bring about paradise. The communists had hoped to get rid of all the inequalities and all the pain and all the problems of modern life. This is what they promised the people. On one occasion I went and preached at another folks' home, and my interpreter said to me, he said, see these men pretty well worked themselves to death to establish the communist dream. And now they're full of frustration and chagrin because they've seen it's come to nothing. Well, that's true all through Russia. The communist leaders promised paradise. And you know, when you go through the underground system in Moscow, it is beautiful. Marble, statues, glorious. For decades, people have come out of their single room in an apartment, which they might have been sharing with another family, got on the metro, seen all this alabaster, all this marble, worked like a dog all day, then went back to their room. The early communist leaders like Stalin wanted wedding cake type of architecture. They wanted grandiose public buildings and so on. But the real needs of the people were never met. The people were ill-fed and ill-clothed and ill-housed. Well, they spent all these millions on making a beautiful underground to impress the tourists. And they did it at the expense of life. They drove that thing through with such rapidity, thousands died in the building up of that metro. Houses would often collapse above. On one occasion, the biography of Khrushchev tells the story that before the day's work began in one particular sector of the underground, a boss came and said to the men, you've got to be very careful today because there's an American family living in the house above. We can't take any risks today. And they took risks all the rest of the time. And houses collapsed. So here communism was trying to bring in a utopia. It failed miserably. You cannot imagine any modern country so dour, so drab, so grey, so hopeless as today's Russia. But now note what I say. We began by talking about Calvary, about the tears and the blasphemy and the cursing. But you know, in that story we also read about paradise, isn't it? The Russians have tried to bring about a paradise and failed miserably because they've been man-centered instead of God-centered. They've had the wrong book. Instead of this book, they've had Das Kapital. They've had the wrong gospel. They've had the gospel according to Lenin. And that's no gospel at all, because men die. Nothing in this life lasts. Beauty and strength are short-lived. Life itself is temporary. Lennon's gospel is no gospel at all. But think how wonderful it is that in the story of our Lord Jesus Christ, his last days on the cross, this picture of reality is not all blood and tears. We've noticed it includes faith and hope and love. But here we have the way to paradise made very plain. And the thief says to him, Lord, remember me when thou comest to thy kingdom. And Christ can say to him, look, today you can know. Today you can know. Paradise is yours. That's true for you and me too, isn't it? If we are looking to Jesus today, if you and I have prayed, Lord, remember me, it is our privilege to know that paradise is ours. Now friends, life won't work without the motive powers of faith, hope and love. And Lenin could never stir those up. The biggest problem in every communist country is getting people to work. Church, yes, easy. Work, almost impossible. As I told you, they joke. The government pretends to pay us, and we pretend to work. Because there's no motivation. But at the cross of Calvary, we have a motivation that creates faith, hope, and love. The assurance that paradise is ours. He that believes on me hath everlasting life. The knowledge we have it now. The reality to be seen and felt and touched is yet future, so we have hope. Hope is seen as not hope, but we are saved by hope. But because of the certainty that it was God the Son who died for us and who rose on the third day, we can be motivated by faith, hope and love, however drab, however sad, however miserable the situation. We're all in dying bodies in a dying world. You can't imagine anything worse than that. In a gigantic sea of space, this world is a floating devil's island. We are all condemned to death on a geographical death row. We were launched at birth on a giant conveyor belt with an inevitable dangerous destiny. Dear friends, without the gospel, that's a miserable affair. The communists promised paradise. They failed. Every human effort to bring lasting joy, if it doesn't take God into account, it must fail. But the glory of the gospel is that God came down here to convince us that he loved us. And all he asks of us is to receive it. When we've received it, it will motivate us. Christians are the least lazy people on earth. I would not work my soul to save, that the Lord has done. But I would work like any slave for love of God's dear Son. To run and work, the law commands, but gives me neither feet nor hands. But better news the gospel brings. It bids me fly and gives me wings. The wings come as we see that God has loved us enough to die for us. And when we accept that gift, we can say there and then, paradise is mine. And whatever the present day is, you know, there was an old coloured preacher that when he preached on Calvary would always say, that was Friday, but Sundays are coming. And however black life looks, you can say, okay, this is Friday. But the resurrection day, the day of glory, that's a coming. Thank you.